I've been thinking about this video for a while now, and I'm hoping that my explanation will make sense. So, I'm gonna set you down here. Let's find a spot, And I'm gonna explain something involving the orientation of 3D space. Let me just make sure that everything's focused. So, as you can see, we have this stake here in the ground, and this is the up vector, right? This is the vector that is coming out of the plane on which we stand upon. One thing that I wanted to do in my quest of deconstructing conventions is using fundamental things in the universe, axioms and definitive forces and definitive vectors to describe things, rather than just concluding something just because it's what I'm used to or an extension of something that I'm used to, which I'll explain in a second. So one force that is everywhere, where there is mass, there is this force, is gravity, right? Now you can instantly, just from that, conclude, oh, so every amount of mass has a gravitational potential vector. In this case, this one's pointing downwards, right? Because when I let go, it goes down. And so from that, I mean, everyone understands gravity to some extent, right? Like we understand that it makes you go this way. Gravity doesn't go this way and everything starts moving that way. Every single observer, so I'm going to be putting you, the camera, but also as the viewer, as the observer, you have an orientation. You have gravity that's working down onto you. And so you can use that vector to describe things in the universe, right? So one thing that I really wanted to talk about, and that I have talked about in the past, is this 3D orientation, right? This sort of axis that you see in applications like Unity, Unreal, Blender, Maya, like all these tools that have a sort of a three-pointed axis that's supposed to orientate things in 3D space. But the issue that I had, and the issue that many people have, is that there is inconsistencies. People don't seem to agree on how to actually define this. So, for the past many years, I've been thinking about this, genuinely. I've been sitting on this for years, because I don't like describing something and articulating something that I'm only partially confident in. But I'm feeling quite confident now, and I'm hoping my explanation makes sense. So we have gravity, right? Gravity is this way, pointing this way. Now, in many ways, you could say, oh, okay, so the axis of gravity is quite important, so this stake should actually be into the ground, and positive should be that way. But the issue is, that's not overly useful. Most things in 3D space, which are upon the plane, which has the normal of gravity, as in this entire axis, no matter positive or negative, things have to be built up from this plane, right? So, like everything, every single object on Earth and every single object in the universe has an orientation already. And this is something that I wanted to make super clear. It's that gravity gives us this normal axis. It gives us this sort of orientation. And we can go, okay, because we're going off nothing, right? We have to push aside all conventions. I'm not even using the 3 letters that are normally used to describe this, because I'm just trying to make it clear that this orientation needs to come from and be derived from axioms and truths and sort of this description that is able to allow us to conclude what is the most correct, which I understand that many people don't like. I personally quite like, and I've devoted a lot of my life to this, the idea of finding the most correct things. This is why I deconstruct conventions. This is why I try to come up with things myself from nothing. Or I try to, right? So in this case, there are two axes that I hope that we can agree on in terms of the positive direction, right? Up, remember from the camera's point of view, up to this one, and forward. So the forward vector, which is from your point of view, because it's the look vector, it's the direction that you as the observer have. You have up, which is aligned with gravity, and forward. Left and right are kind of the same thing. And this is where it gets kind of weird. It's sort of like an importance thing. Now you could say, oh, but backwards is more important. You could make that argument, but it's not as solid, right? Left and right, the positive could be either way, right? Quite literally, if you're left-handed, you might think that positive left makes more sense than positive right. Sure, okay, and that's something that I do understand and I would agree on. But since I'm right-handed, I put just slightly more priority on right over left. So I put the positive axis that way for the left or left and right sort of axis. Now, this is the bit where it gets kind of complicated, because to get this idea using the 2D plane on which we stand upon and gravity and turning it into something that everyone can understand, I unfortunately do have to add letters. So the order in which the letters are in technically doesn't matter. It's kind of redundant. But when we're thinking about the priority of axes, there is a slight priority to it. So the way that I think about this is, when you're moving something left and right, the size of the object does not change per se, right? From your perspective, it doesn't change. We are just moving it left and right, and that's the same for up and down, right? It's when we move things forward and back that the size of this, in terms of perspective, changes. So in some ways, you could say that left and right and up and down are slightly more important than forwards and backwards, because we want to start with things that don't change. So in this case, because gravity is something we can't really change, or at least this axis, so in some ways we can conclude, okay, well, let's just say left and right is the most important axis in this case. So that's the first one. The second one, going off the idea that we have this plane, would probably be forward and backwards, which you might think, but doesn't that just go against what I just said about how, you know, things change or not? But we're trying to create a 2D plane, and we need to also align with the plane that we stand on, which has the normal of gravity, right? The first step was to just find one out of the three that we want to see as the most important, which in this case is left and right. But now we have to conform to the plane, so we're like, okay, so the second one has to be forward and backwards, right? Then the third would be up and down with gravity. So you can use the plane and you can use gravity as a way of orientating things. And so aligning that understanding with typical ways of describing axes and the alphabet, I guess, despite how, you know, if you have a fourth dimension, people use W, which doesn't make sense. It would be X, Y, Z, right? X, Y, Z. And if you see it like this, and if you see it as a plane, the XY plane in which you move on, you position something in XY, and then you position it in Z, it suddenly becomes really clear. It suddenly makes sense to place things in 3D space. Because gravity is now in 3D space, by the way, because people get confused with things like 2D games, which are X and Y, and especially platformers. I made a platformer, I know this too, Y is this way, right? Like, because it's on the screen. But the issue I have with that is that we are so used to looking at an upright screen that it just distorts that XY plane. It distorts it. It shouldn't actually be upright. In the same way that before screens, you know, people would write on a table and it would be X and Y. So it's like in 2D space, and we're dealing with 2D, the orientation of this plane doesn't really matter. So we need that distinction between 2D and 3D, which is why you can't just conclude that 3D is just an extension of 2D by adding another axis, right? Because it relies on the orientation of the 2D plane that you're using to add that extra axis on. If you believe that, you know, if you're so used to screens and being upright, you're just going to conclude the axis is through the screen. But if you're a cartographer, or, I don't know, you do stuff on a table, you could be like, well, no, it's either up or down, because X and Y is already defined as the plane. And this is something that I wanted to make clear. You've got to remind yourself that when you're trying to understand things, especially when you're trying to create an orientation in 3D, you have to derive it from the ground up, quite literally. You have to derive it from axioms and understandings that don't change. Gravity is something that will always exist, so you need to have that as the defining normal of the plane. I'm hoping this made sense. I know that on my post, I had like 40% of people saying yes, 40% of people saying no, and 20% of people just not really having an opinion and just wanting to hear me out, which I appreciate, by the way. Excuse me. Yeah, and I just want to make this clear. I feel like the more you think about this, the more you think about the XY plane being the plane in which we stand upon, and then gravity being the extra dimension, it all makes sense. You can build stuff in 3D way more intuitively because you're using your human orientation, your axis that you're already using. When you're standing upright and you're working against gravity, you already have this orientation. You're walking on the XY plane, right? Anyway, so I hope this made sense. Let me know what you think in the comments, and yeah, I hope to make more videos about these sort of things. I want to describe very nuanced things as well as I can, and to show people that you don't have to just follow conventions because you're told. Or if you use Minecraft or Unity and you're used to being X and Z, which it's like, it makes sense. If you're making something like a tool and you put just any old letters, then anyone who uses that tool is just going to accept that as normal. So you need to derive this yourself. And so I hope that this explanation makes sense, and that you see what I mean when I say that the most correct orientation for 3D space is X, Y, and Z in order of priority. So thank you for watching, and thank you to all my patrons for helping out all these months, and I'm hoping to make more content. So thank you.